The horse screamed, not the high, thin cry of an animal that had spooked at something in the dark. This was something older than that, low and guttural and desperate, the kind of sound that travels through walls and timber and frozen ground and finds you in your sleep like a hand closing around your throat. Maeve was already awake. She had been awake for 3 hours, lying flat on her back in the dark, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside her window. The snow had started the previous afternoon as something almost gentle, fine flakes drifting sideways, the kind that catch on your eyelashes and melt before you can look at them. By midnight, it had become a different thing entirely. The wind pushed walls of white across the open fields, buried the fence posts to their crossbeams, and drove the cold so deep into the bones of the house that the old wood cracked and popped like a dying fire. She heard the horse again, and this time, there was something else in the sound, a strangeness she couldn't name, a frequency that didn't belong to the storm. Maeve sat up, pulled on her boots in the dark, and moved toward the door. She had no way of knowing what waited on the other side of it. Before we go any further, there's something about this story that I want you to think about as we move through it together. There's a moment in this story where a woman who has been completely alone, who chose to be alone, who built walls out of grief and kept the whole world on the other side of them, opens a door in the middle of a blizzard. Not because she was ready to, not because someone asked her to, but because something in her wouldn't let her stop moving. And I want to ask you something before we begin. Have you ever done something like that? Have you ever moved towards something frightening simply because standing still felt worse? Think about that as we go. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. If this kind of story finds something inside you, hit like and subscribe, because we come here every week to tell stories exactly like this one. And now, let's go back to the night the storm changed everything on Cold Creek Ranch. The ranch sat on the eastern slope of a ridge that had no name on any modern map, only on the old ones. The hand-drawn kind with faded ink and ink blot elevations, the kind the county surveyor's office kept in a box in a closet and never opened. Cold Creek Ranch. 63 acres of high meadow, pine forest, and creek bottom pasture pressed against the boundary of protected tribal land to the north and west. The kind of place that looks, in summer, like something out of a painting, the kind of painting you see at a gas station art show and think is too pretty to be real. Maeve had come here 31 years ago as a young woman from Ohio who had never ridden a horse in her life and had no particular reason to start. She had come for a man named Gerald, who had grown up on this land and carried it everywhere he went, the way people carry accents. Gerald repaired what needed repairing, rose before dawn without complaint, and understood horses the way some people understand music, not as a skill, but as a language they were simply born speaking. Together, they had turned the ranch into something quietly remarkable. A small rehabilitation facility for traumatized horses, animals pulled from neglect and abuse and given time, grass, and the particular kind of patience Gerald seemed to have in endless supply. They had no children. They had each other. And for 3 decades, that felt like more than enough. Gerald died the previous January. A stroke, fast and without warning, in the middle of feeding the horses on a Tuesday morning. He was found by Maeve when she came out to call him for breakfast, still holding the feed bucket, leaned against the stall door in a way that looked, from a distance, almost peaceful. It was not peaceful. Maeve spent the months after the funeral running the ranch by sheer mechanical routine. She fed the animals. She filed the paperwork. She returned phone calls she didn't want to return and signed checks she didn't want to sign. She moved through the days the way you move through rooms in a house where the power has gone out, slowly, with one hand out in front of you, feeling for edges. She stopped taking new horses. She stopped returning calls from the 2 other ranchers who had once collaborated with her on rehabilitation placements. She canceled the annual spring open day for the first time in 20 years and didn't explain why to anyone. The closest town was 37 minutes by truck on dry roads. Maeve had not driven those roads in 6 weeks. The ranch had 4 horses now, down from the 11 it held at Gerald's death. 3 of them were long-term residents, older animals, gentle and settled and familiar. The 4th was different. His name, on the intake paperwork, was listed as Broker's Star, a name someone had given him in the auction house from which Maeve had purchased him 8 months ago, against her better judgment, because something about the way he held himself in the pen, still and watchful and furious, had reminded her of Gerald in a way she couldn't quite explain and had stopped trying to. The horse was a 17-year-old gray stallion with a scar along his left jaw that no one had documented the origin of. He was not violent. He was not broken. He was something harder to name than either of those things. He was simply unreachable. He accepted feed. He tolerated being led. He stood at the far corner of his stall and watched the world with eyes that gave nothing back. Every attempt Maeve had made in 8 months to build something with him had ended in the same way. The horse looking through her, past her, at some fixed point beyond the stall wall, as though she were simply weather, as though she were simply something to be waited out. She had not named him anything other than Broker's Star, because naming him something real felt like a presumption. The bank had sent 2 letters in November. The kind of letters that arrive in plain envelopes and use words like review period and financial assessment and deferred maintenance liability. Maeve had put them in the kitchen drawer with the rubber bands and the expired coupons and had not opened the drawer since. Abner Crane had come by twice in person. He was not a cruel man in the conventional sense. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten openly, did not take pleasure in the visible discomfort of others. He was the kind of man who simply had a plan and the institutional authority to implement it, and who had long since stopped being troubled by the human geography that plans sometimes move through. The Madeira, the timber operation backed by a consortium of 3 outside investors, needed land. Cold Creek's acreage was ideally situated. The math was clean. Abner had knocked. Maeve had answered both times. The conversations had been brief and civil and entirely without resolution. Each time he left, she stood at the window and watched his truck disappear down the access road and felt something in her chest that was neither rage nor fear, but something between them, a pressure that had no exit. Then the storm came, and with it, the night that would rearrange everything. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read -14 Fahrenheit when Maeve stepped outside. The wind hit her the moment the door opened. Not a gust, but a sustained push, the kind that finds the gaps in your clothing immediately and works its way in with quiet, clinical thoroughness. She had layered quickly in the dark. Thermal underlayer, flannel shirt, the heavy barn coat that still held Gerald's smell in its collar on cold mornings if she pressed her face into it, which she didn't. Work gloves. Hat pulled low. A flashlight she had to hit against her palm twice to bring to life. The stables were 40 yards from the house. On a clear night, she could cross that ground in under a minute. Tonight, with the snow up past her knee on the windward side and visibility down to the width of the flashlight's beam, it took her nearly 4. She heard Broker's Star again before she reached the stable door. That low, fractured sound, less like crying than like something being torn. But there was also, now that she was close enough, something else. A quality to the silence between the sounds. A weight to it. She pushed the stable door open. The 3 older horses were pressed together at the far end of the building, as far from Broker's Star's stall as the structure allowed. Their ears were pinned back. Their breath came in short white plumes in the frozen air. They were not looking at Maeve. They were looking at the far stall. Broker's Star's stall door was open. She crossed the stable floor without thinking, rounded the corner of the stall partition, and stopped. The stallion stood against the outer wall of the stall, pressed into the corner, his body angled sideways as though shielding something. His head was down, not in submission, but in the specific posture of an animal bending over something on the ground. His breath came in long, shuddering exhalations. And at his feet, in the straw, half covered by the horse's own body heat and the thin protection of a thermal emergency blanket that had somehow wrapped itself around one arm and shoulder. A boy. He was small and dark-haired and still. His lips had gone the wrong color. His hands, where they were visible, were curled against his chest in the involuntary posture of extreme cold. Not a chosen position, but a biological one. The body conserving what it could. One arm was wrapped around the stallion's left foreleg in a grip that even unconsciousness hadn't released. Maeve stood there for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she was on her knees in the straw. He was breathing. Shallow and too slow, but breathing. His skin, where she pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, was cold in a way that live skin shouldn't be. Cold all the way through, no warmth at the surface, but the pulse was there. Faint, present. The stallion shifted slightly, but did not move away. He stood over the boy with a stillness Maeve had never seen from him. Not the frozen watchfulness he usually offered the world, but something different. Deliberate. As though he had chosen this position and intended to keep it. She didn't stop to ask herself how the boy had gotten in, or why. or what he was doing this far from anything in the middle of a historic blizzard. Those questions would come later. Right now, there was only the single arithmetic of the moment. The boy was cold, and she was warm, and the distance between those two states was the only thing that mattered. She got her arms under him. He was light, lighter than she expected, lighter than a 14-year-old boy should be after a night in the cold. She lifted him in one motion that pulled at something in her lower back and carried him out of the stall without looking back at the horse. The walk to the house was the longest 40 yards of her life. She had to stop once, halfway, when the wind hit her broadside and nearly took her legs. She held the boy against her chest and leaned into it and kept moving. The flashlight was gone, dropped somewhere in the stable. She didn't know when. She navigated by the pale glow of the snow itself, the way the blizzard threw its own dim light back from the ground. The house appeared in front of her like something surfacing from deep water. Inside, she put him on the couch nearest the wood stove and began working. She had been doing this for 30 years, warming hypothermic animals, bringing them back from the edge of it, and the procedure was nearly identical for a human body. Wet clothes off, she cut his jacket and outer shirt rather than waste time with frozen buttons. Dry blankets layered fast, starting from the core outward. Not too much heat too quickly. The stove at medium, not high. Hot water bottles wrapped in towels and placed at the armpits and groin where the major vessels ran close to the surface. His clothes, once removed, told a partial story. Heavy-duty, outdoor thermal layers. Well-made, not cheap gear. A pair of beaded cords tied to his right wrist. Handmade, intricate. No phone, no ID, no pack. Just the clothes he was wearing and a small leather pouch on a cord around his neck that she tucked back in when she found it, not opening it. He came back slowly. The color returned to his fingers first, then his lips. Over the course of almost an hour, that particular cold-to-warm transition that looked almost like bruising before it resolved. His breathing steadied. At some point, without fully waking, he turned his face toward the heat of the stove in a gesture so instinctive it didn't belong to consciousness. Maeve sat in Gerald's chair and watched him. Outside, the storm was still at full force. The windows were opaque with blown snow. The power had gone out sometime in the last hour. She hadn't noticed when, and the house existed now only in the radius of the wood stove's light, the rest of it falling away into shadow. She had one kerosene lamp burning on the kitchen table, 2 candles on the windowsill. She looked at the boy's face in the firelight. She had no idea who he was, but she knew, with a certainty she couldn't have explained, that the stallion had been keeping him warm, that the horse she had spent 8 months unable to reach had spent the storm bent over this boy like a question she had never thought to ask. He woke around 5 in the morning. The storm had neither worsened nor relented. It had simply become the permanent condition of the world, a white static pressing against every window, a low continuous howl in the chimney flue that had the same tonal quality as a note held too long on a cello string. His eyes opened and found the ceiling first, then the walls, then Maeve, sitting 4 feet away in the chair with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and a stillness that had nothing to do with sleep. He didn't speak immediately. He lay there and did the inventory that people do when they wake in unfamiliar places, taking in each element of the room with a slow, methodical attention. His eyes were dark, the kind of dark that catches light and holds it. There was no panic in them, which surprised her. There was something that might have been assessment and something beneath that which she couldn't read. He tried to sit up. His arms gave way on the first attempt, and he dropped back against the cushions with a breath he didn't quite manage to keep from being audible. He tried again more carefully, using the arm of the couch this time, and made it to sitting. She set down the cup and leaned forward and said, quietly, that he didn't need to move, that he could stay where he was, that it was still dark and still blizzarding, and that nowhere was better than here right now. He looked at her while she said this. His expression didn't change in the way of someone who doesn't understand. It changed in the way of someone listening to a language they know partially, parsing the sounds for the ones they recognize. He said something, short, 3 syllables, in a language she didn't know. Not a question, something closer to an acknowledgement. She asked him his name. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, carefully, slowly, as though testing the weight of the English word in his mouth, Chayton. She nodded. Maeve, she said, touching her own sternum. He repeated it, Maeve, with a slight shift in the vowel that made it sound like a word from somewhere else, somewhere older, which in a way it was. That was the extent of the conversation for the next hour. She brought him warm broth, a simple stock she'd made from the bones she kept in the freezer, the kind of thing she made for herself on the worst days of the winter because it required almost nothing from her except a pot and a stove in 40 minutes. She set it on the side table next to him without commentary. He wrapped both hands around it and bent his face over the steam for a long moment before drinking. She went out once to check the horses. The storm nearly took her again on the step. The wind had changed direction and hit the porch from the northwest now, and the snow was coming sideways in a hard, glittering sheet. She made it to the stable and back in 8 minutes, moving fast. When she returned, she stopped in the doorway. The boy was at the kitchen window. He was standing with one hand on the cold glass, not looking at the storm, but looking in the direction of the stable. She could tell by the angle of his head. His other hand was pressed flat against his chest over the small leather pouch. He was completely still. Outside, the wind drove another wave of white across the yard, and the stable disappeared in it for a moment and then reappeared, darker and closer seeming in the way things become when the snow is thick. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at her. She understood, without knowing how, that he was asking about the horse. She told him the horse was fine. She held up one hand, a gesture more of demonstration than language, and said the horse was inside. Warm. She said he was fine. The boy's shoulders dropped about half an inch. He went back to the couch. They sat through the rest of the pre-dawn hours in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She slept in the chair for perhaps 90 minutes, a thin and surface-level sleep, the kind you get when you're not willing to fully let your guard down, but your body overrides you anyway. When she woke, the boy was asleep again, properly this time, face slack, breathing slow and even, one hand still loosely holding the edge of the blanket. The dawn brought a gray light that changed nothing about the storm's intensity, but at least gave the darkness somewhere to go. With the light came the sound she had dreaded, tires on gravel. The truck that pulled up to the house gate was familiar. A dark blue pickup with county plates that she had seen twice before, parked in the same spot, driven by the same man. Abner Crane stepped out into the wind as though the temperature were a personal inconvenience rather than a danger, buttoning his coat with the deliberate movements of a man who was not in a hurry because he didn't need to be. Maeve stood at the window and watched him approach. The boy was asleep on her couch. There was no version of this moment that was going to be simple. She went to the door before Abner reached the porch. She preferred to be already standing when she opened it, not scrambling in response to a knock. He stood on the top porch step with the snow behind him like a curtain and the wind lifting the brim of his hat. His face was arranged in the particular configuration he used for difficult conversations. Not unkind, not warm, professionally neutral in the way that lets a person say almost anything without being accused of cruelty. He had heard, he said, that there had been some activity at the ranch last night. A welfare check. He'd been in contact with the county sheriff's office about road conditions when a report came in about a miner from the reservation who had gone missing during the storm. He had thought, given the proximity of her property to the tribal lands. He paused. His eyes had moved past her shoulder to the couch. The boy was awake. He had woken during the approach of the truck. Something about the sound of it, or something else entirely. And he was sitting upright, watching Abner Crane with an expression that was entirely without fear and entirely without trust. Abner looked at Maeve. A long, considered pause. He said that he was going to need to call the County Children's Services office. That harboring a minor from the reservation without notification to the relevant authorities was a violation of district oversight protocols. That he was sure she understood. The silence that followed belonged entirely to Maeve. She did not invite him inside. That was the first thing. She stood in the doorway, filling it with the specific kind of stillness that is not passivity, but its exact opposite. A stillness that says, I am not moving from this position, and you are going to have to decide what that means to you. Abner waited on the porch step. Behind him, the storm went on with its total indifference. He said again, more carefully this time, that the situation needed to be properly managed, that there were protocols, that the tribal administration itself would expect. She said, once, that the boy was warm and safe and sleeping in her house, and that she had found him in the stable at 3 in the morning with frostbite on both hands and a core temperature that would have put him in the ground by dawn if she had left him there. She said it the way you say a fact, without decoration. Abner absorbed this. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in the way of a man filing information. He said that he understood it must have been a difficult night, and that he was certain her motivations were correct, and that regardless of all of that, there were procedures. There were oversight requirements. There were, he said, and here he paused in the particular way of a man choosing his next word with surgical precision. There were questions of liability. The word hung in the cold air between them. Maeve knew exactly what the word was attached to. It was attached to the letters in the drawer. It was attached to the financial review and the deferred maintenance liability and the two conversations she had already had with this man in this same spot about the timber operation and the acreage and the clean math of what her land was worth and what she owed and how those two numbers sat in relation to each other. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said that she thought he should come back when the roads were safe. She stepped back and closed the door. She stood on the inside of it with her hand on the knob and listened to the porch step creak once, twice, as his weight shifted. She heard him standing there. The wind pushed against the house. 20 seconds, 30, then his boots on the steps, going down. She heard the truck door and the engine and the crunch of tires backing through packed snow. She stood at the window and watched until the truck was gone. She turned. The boy was watching her from the couch. She crossed to the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove and stood there with her back to the room for a while, her hands flat on the counter. The kettle began to tick with the expansion of heating metal. Later that morning, when the boy's hands had warmed enough that his fine motor control had returned, he went to the stable. She didn't stop him. She walked with him. He was still unsteady on his feet, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating a body that isn't fully reliable yet. And she stayed back near the stable door while he went to Broker Starr's stall. What happened next was not dramatic. There were no grand gestures. The boy stood outside the stall for a while, without moving. The stallion stood at the far corner and watched him with those opaque, closed-off eyes that Maeve had looked into for 8 months without getting anything back. The two of them existed in a silence that had a different quality than the silence she was used to. Not absence, but something almost structural, like two notes that together make a chord that neither makes alone. The boy made a sound, low, more breath than voice, a single syllable on an exhale, and then he went quiet again. The stallion's left ear moved forward. Maeve stood at the stable door and did not breathe. Over the next 20 minutes, the boy moved closer by degrees, so small they were barely perceptible. Not approaching, not retreating, simply existing in closer and closer proximity. Each increment the product of something between them she had no framework for and had stopped trying to apply one to. The stallion's posture shifted incrementally, that fixed vigilance softening by degrees, the angle of his neck lowering by millimeters, the quality of his breathing changing in ways she felt rather than heard. When the boy finally pressed his palm flat against the stallion's jaw, the scarred side, the side no one had ever touched without the horse pulling back, Maeve looked away. She didn't know why she looked away. Something about the moment felt private in a way that her presence violated. She looked at the snow outside through the open stable door. She looked at the fence posts, barely visible, half buried in white drifts. She looked at the mountains beyond the fence line, invisible today behind the weather but present in the way that large things are present even when you can't see them, in the scale of the light, in the weight of the air. She heard the stallion exhale, long and slow and deep, the sound of something being set down. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She had told herself, in the months since Gerald died, that Broker Starr was a horse that couldn't be reached. She had constructed that certainty carefully, the way you construct certainties when you need them to hold, when you need the world to make the kind of sense that keeps you moving from one day to the next. If the horse was unreachable, then her failure to reach him was not a failure. If the horse was unreachable, then no one could. And if no one could, not even the woman who had been doing this for 30 years, then whatever had been lost was lost completely, and the cleanest thing was to stop trying. The boy's palm on the stallion's scarred jaw rearranged that certainty without asking permission. She stood there for a while after, in the stable doorway, in the cold. Then she went back inside and put more wood on the fire. The storm began to break around midday. Not suddenly. The wind dropped first, the hard directional push of it easing into something more variable and uncertain, gusting in different directions as though losing conviction. The snow thinned from its earlier density to something lighter and more diffuse, a drift rather than a wall. By early afternoon, the mountains were visible again in glimpses, brief clearings in the cloud cover that revealed snow-covered ridges so bright in the emerging light that they seemed to generate their own illumination. Maeve spent the afternoon hours doing what she always did when she couldn't make sense of something. She worked. She repaired a gap in the stable wall with boards she'd been meaning to address since October. She cleared the drainage channel at the south end of the property, which had iced over and was threatening to back up into the lower pasture. She mucked the stalls of the 3 older horses, moving through the familiar motions with the automatic competence of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about the execution of it. The boy helped. He appeared at her side around noon, still moving with the careful economy of someone whose body was reporting back from yesterday, and began working alongside her without being asked. He observed each task briefly before joining it, with the attention of someone accustomed to learning through watching rather than instruction. He was careful. He was precise. He broke nothing and needed to be corrected for nothing. They worked without speaking because speaking was not what the work required. Maeve found herself watching him, in the peripheral way, the way you watch someone when you're trying to understand them without the obligation of eye contact. He was 14, but he carried himself with a groundedness that reminded her of much older men. Not stoicism exactly, not the performed stillness of someone suppressing something, but the genuine ease of someone who had been taught that silence was not an absence, but a presence. He moved through the world the way Gerald had moved through it, she thought, and then stopped thinking that, because it was the kind of thought that could get away from you. In the late afternoon, he sat near the wood stove with the small leather pouch from his neck open in his hands. He worked carefully. She glimpsed dried herbs, small stones, a twist of something dark that might have been bark. He mixed them by touch rather than measurement, slowly, the way you work when the work itself matters more than the product. She didn't ask, and he didn't explain, and the kettle came to a boil, and she made tea for both of them, and set his cup next to him on the side table, and he glanced up and nodded. That evening, she fed the horses while he stood in Broker Starr's stall in the dark. When she looked in, the stallion had his head resting on the boy's shoulder. Not leaning, resting. The specific weight of trust. She kept moving. She had been thinking about Abner since the morning, in the way you think about a problem while you're doing other things, not directly, but keeping it in peripheral awareness, knowing it is there and that it will require a decision. He would come back. There was no version of this in which he did not come back. He had seen the boy. He had the county contacts and the legal framework and the documentation request already half assembled in his mind when he drove away. She had seen it in the way he paused on the porch step before descending, doing the arithmetic. The question was not whether he would return. The question was what she would do when he did. She thought about the letters in the drawer, about the financial review, the deferred maintenance liability, the clean math of what her land was worth. She was not naive about her position. The ranch was behind on 2 separate loan instruments. The timber operations offer was below market value by any standard measurement, but it was real money and it was available, and it arrived at a time when her alternatives were contracting rather than expanding. She had no partner, no family money, no reserves beyond what the horses themselves represented as an asset. The legal exposure Abner was describing, harboring a minor without notification, complicating a county search and rescue situation, obstructing a welfare check, was real. He wasn't inventing it. She could call the county sheriff's office herself, right now. Report that she had found the boy, that he was safe, that he needed to be returned. It was the simple choice, the safe choice, the choice that took the weapon out of Abner's hand by removing the situation that gave it weight. She stood at the kitchen window in the dark, the phone on the counter 6 inches from her hand. Outside, the remaining clouds had gone pink and then purple with the last of the light. The mountains stood clear and enormous above the ranch. The snow on the flat ground had that particular post-storm stillness. Unbroken, blue-shadowed, perfectly quiet. A fence post near the gate had a hawk on it, sitting motionless, facing the mountains, doing whatever hawks do in the cold that looks from a distance like pure waiting. Maeve looked at the phone. She didn't pick it up. She wasn't sure, in that moment, that she could explain why. She was not a person who made dramatic choices. She was not a person who thought of herself as brave or principled in ways that required demonstration. She was a person who ran a ranch and fixed fences and kept horses alive and had built her entire adult life in the space between what needed doing and what got done. But she looked at the phone, and then she looked at the window, and the hawk was still on the fence post, and the boy was in the stable with the stallion, and the silence of the kitchen was full in a way the silence of the past 11 months had not been. She moved away from the counter. She went to the stable. She brought both of them, the boy and the horse, inside for the evening, which she'd never done before, and made a space by the wood stove big enough for a 14-year-old boy to sleep through the night without cold finding him. She said nothing to him about what she'd decided. There was nothing to say. He looked at her once, before she turned out the lamp, with those dark eyes that gave back the light in the particular way of someone who already knew. Abner came back at 7:45 the next morning. He did not come alone. There were 2 county vehicles behind his truck, a white SUV with the sheriff's department seal, and a gray sedan that she recognized from memory as belonging to the district child welfare office. He had moved faster than she had given him credit for. Or perhaps he had simply been ready, had assembled the machinery overnight while the storm finished its retreat, had made the calls from his kitchen while the temperature outside rose back to something manageable. Maeve was at the window when they turned off the main road onto her access track. She had slept 4 hours. She had woken at 5 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and worked through what was coming the way you work through something you can't change, steadily, without flinching, trying to be honest about what you had and what you were willing to spend. The boy was still sleeping when she checked on him at 6. She left him alone. At 6:30, she had gone to the stable. She stood outside Broker Star's stall for a while without going in. The stallion watched her with the same opaque attention as always, except that it wasn't the same. She knew that now. She had seen the alternative, and she knew what the same looked like up against it. There was something present in the horse this morning that hadn't been there yesterday morning. Not warmth, exactly. More like acknowledgement. The sense of being registered rather than endured. She stood there for a while, and then she went back to the house and had her coffee and waited. Now the vehicles were pulling into the yard, and she put on her coat and went outside before any doors had opened. Abner stepped out first, then the sheriff's deputy, a young man she didn't know by name, who had the practiced neutral expression of someone trained not to project outcome. Then the woman from child welfare, mid-40s, clipboard already in hand in a way that suggested the gesture had become automatic. Abner crossed the yard with his hat in his hand, which was, she understood, his gesture toward civility. He told her they were there to facilitate the return of the minor to the relevant authorities and to address several matters of county protocol. He spoke evenly. He was not gloating. He was not vindictive. He was doing the thing he had decided to do, and he was doing it in the way he did things, methodically, without visible feeling, which was its own kind of cold. The deputy had his hands at his sides and was looking at the stable. Maeve looked at Abner. She said, "He's not here." A silence. Abner's eyes moved across her face the way eyes move when they're checking something they're not sure they've read correctly. He said that her vehicle was in the yard, and there were no other tracks in the snow, and the county road hadn't been passable until this morning, and, she said, he walked out. Another silence. Longer. She said it calmly. She said that sometime in the early morning hours, while she was sleeping, Chayton had let himself out of the house and left. She said she had looked for him at first light and found no trace of him on the property. She said that given the direction of the tribal lands to the north and west, she expected he had gone home. Every word of this was true. She had woken at 4:30 to the sound of the front door. By the time she had gotten to the window, there was only a set of footprints in the snow leading north along the fence line and then turning into the tree line at the property boundary. She had watched them for a moment, those small prints in the blue pre-dawn dark. She had thought of calling out. She hadn't. She had gone to the stable instead and found Broker Star standing with his head over the stall door, watching the north fence with his ears forward, as though listening to something receding. On the stallion's cabicata, the halter Gerald had made himself, years ago, from leather he'd bought at a fair in Billings, there was a feather, tied to the noseband with a thin strip of hide, intricate and deliberate, and placed with the care of something that was not accidental and was not small. The feather of a bald eagle, brown-tipped, the calamus still clean and tight. She had stood there for a long time. Now she stood in the yard and looked at Abner and the deputy and the woman with the clipboard, and she waited. Abner looked at the ground briefly. He said that he understood and that he was going to need to document her account formally. He said that the situation remained one in which her judgment regarding notification protocols would need to be assessed. He said the formal review of the ranch's operational status and financial compliance was proceeding regardless, and that she should expect a communication within the next several days detailing the remediation requirements. He said all of this without raising his voice. He said it in the tone of a man reading from an internal document. Then he looked at her directly and said, "Maeve, you should think carefully about the position you're putting yourself in." She said nothing. She had moved, in the hours since she'd seen those footprints, through something she couldn't fully articulate. Not anger. Anger required the energy of believing the outcome was still in play. Not grief. Exactly, though there was grief involved. Something that sat below both of those. Something that had to do with the feather on the halter and the specific way the stallion had been looking north at 4:30 in the morning, and the fact that a boy she had never met had spent 30 minutes in the dark with her most unreachable horse and had come out the other side of it with something in his hands she'd been trying to hold for 8 months and couldn't. She had looked at Gerald's photograph in the kitchen before she'd put her coat on to come outside. The one from their second summer here, before the barn addition, when the whole ranch still looked provisional. A man with his arm around a fence post as though he were holding it up rather than it holding him, squinting into the sun, grinning at the camera with the easy pleasure of someone who believed, genuinely and without reservation, that where he stood was exactly where he was supposed to be. She had looked at it for a while. Then she had put her coat on and gone outside. Now she looked at Abner Crane in the cold morning light, and she said, simply, "Do what you need to do." Not as a surrender, not as a defeat, as a statement about what she was willing to lose and what she had decided, somewhere in the pre-dawn silence of the stable, she was not willing to bend toward. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the filing gesture again, and turned back to his truck. The deputy and the welfare officer exchanged a look and followed. Doors closed. Engine started. She watched the 3 vehicles back out of the yard and down the access track and disappear behind the tree line on the road's curve. She stood in the yard for a while after they were gone. The morning was very quiet. The snow stretched out in every direction unmarked, and the mountains were completely clear for the first time since the storm, their ridgelines sharp and white against a sky that had gone the particular pale blue of late winter mornings, a color that existed only in Montana, she had always thought, a color that had no equivalent in the other places she had briefly been. The hawk was back on the fence post. She stood in the yard and looked at the mountains and breathed. Then, from the direction of the north, from beyond the fence line, beyond the tree line, from the direction of the tribal lands, she heard something. At first she could not identify it. It was rhythmic, and it was low, and it was not the wind or the trees or any of the sounds this land made when it was only itself. It was the sound of hooves, multiple and approaching. She turned toward the north fence and stood very still, one hand raised to shade her eyes against the morning glare, and she waited. They came out of the tree line like a painting becoming real. First the horses, a dozen of them, then more, moving in a loose group through the broken snow of the forest edge with the particular ease of animals that knew this terrain and owned it in the way only long familiarity confers. Behind them, on foot, figures, many figures, moving in the same quiet, steady way the horses moved, unhurried, purposeful, covering the ground between the tree line and her fence as though they had all the time in the world and had already decided exactly what they intended to do with it. Maeve stood at the fence and watched them come. There were, she would estimate later, somewhere between 200 and 300 people. Men, women, children, some on horseback, most on foot. They were dressed for the cold, heavy coats, boots, the thick practical clothing of people who understood winter from the inside. Several carried tools, shovels, poles, bundles of timber. Others carried supplies, bales of hay stacked on sleds, bags of grain, objects wrapped in canvas she couldn't immediately identify. Not one of them was moving quickly. Not one of them was speaking loudly. The silence of the approach was the first thing that reached her across the snow, before even the sound of the horses. The absence of urgency, of aggression, of anything that looked like arrival in the demanding sense. They moved toward her fence with the deliberateness of people carrying out something that had already been fully decided and required no announcement. At the gate, the group parted. An old man moved forward. He was tall and unhurried, and he moved with the careful dignity of someone for whom each step was a considered thing rather than a mechanical one. His face was deeply lined, his white hair pulled back under a dark hat. He carried nothing in his hands. He stopped at the fence gate. He and Maeve looked at each other through the bars of it for a moment. Then he reached out and opened the latch himself, the old metal bar of it that she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, and pushed the gate open and stepped through, and she took a step back and let him. He came to stand 2 feet from her. He looked at her face. He looked at the ranch behind her, the stable, the house, the broken section of roof on the stable's east end that had been deteriorating since before Gerald died, and that she had never had the money or the will to address. Then he lowered his head, not a bow exactly, more a slow, intentional inclination, and he spoke. His English was careful and accented and precise. He said that his name was Tall Bear, and that his grandson had come home at dawn with warmth still in his hands in the middle of a storm that took warmth from everything it touched. He said that the boy had told them of the woman and the horse and the fire. He paused. He said that his people had a understanding, older than the county lines and the bank letters and the road they'd driven in on. He said that whoever saves a child of the land takes the land into their heart, and whoever takes the land into their heart is never alone on it again. He said it quietly. He said it without theater. Behind him, without waiting for any further signal, the people who had come with him had already spread across the yard and the stable approach and the field beyond it. The ones with tools went directly to the broken roof section. The ones with hay went directly to the stable. The ones with grain went to the storage shed. They moved with the efficiency of people who had looked at a problem and already organized its solution before arriving. Maeve watched this for a long moment. Her hands, at her sides, were shaking, not from cold. The old man looked at her. He said, gently, "Your silence is not emptiness. We see that now." She looked past him at the stable, at the roof that was already receiving attention, hands working with tools against the clear winter sky, at her horses being given hay by strangers who moved among them without hesitation, at the gate, still open, through which the community kept coming. She said, because it was the only true thing she had, "I didn't know anyone was coming." He said, he knew. 3 days after the storm, the snow was retreating. It went the way Montana snow always goes in late winter, not suddenly but steadily, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving dark earth in irregular patches that grew daily. The creek at the property's western edge, which had been frozen solid since December, showed a dark line of open water down its center. The cottonwoods along the bank had not yet budded, but they had lightened somehow, a change in the quality of the bark's gray that suggested readiness rather than dormancy. The stable roof was repaired. The work had taken the better part of 2 days. A team of 7 men who knew timber and structure and cold weather construction, who had brought their own materials and their own tools, and had declined the coffee she offered 3 times before accepting it on the 4th. The new section of roofing was slightly brighter than the old, though would not yet weather to match. It would take a season to blend in. She thought she would not mind looking at the difference in the meantime. Broker's Star had not returned to the corner of his stall. He stood now at the stall door when the other horses moved in the yard, head up, watching. He ate without the particular tension she'd become accustomed to monitoring during feed times, the slight flattening of his ears, the shift of his weight that preceded refusal. He was not transformed. He was not a different animal. He was the same horse, with the same scar and the same long history of whatever had happened to him before she'd found him in that auction pen. But something in the geometry of him had changed, some adjustment in the way he occupied his space, as though he had moved slightly toward the world rather than continuing to hold his ground against it. She called him something other than Broker's Star for the first time on the morning after the community came. She said it quietly, almost by accident, while she was cleaning out his water bucket. She called him Creek. It had come from nowhere in particular, or perhaps from the sound of the water running again along the property's edge. He had looked at her, not through her, at her. Abner Crane sent a letter 4 days after the storm. It arrived in the same kind of plain envelope as the previous 2, but this one was thinner. She opened it at the kitchen table with the morning coffee, which was a change. The letters in the drawer she had never opened with coffee. She had avoided them entirely. The letter informed her that the financial review process for Cold Creek Ranch had been postponed pending a reclassification of the property's adjacent land status. The tribal authority had filed a formal designation request with the state land office, citing historical and cultural use of the creek corridor running through the property boundary. The processing of any annexation or acquisition request in the adjacent zone was suspended for a minimum review period of 18 months. There was a second paragraph. Abner had written it in the same even, flat prose of the first, but there was something different about its tone, a very slight shift in register, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you only notice if you've read the same man's letters before. He wrote that given the suspension of the review process, the bank was prepared to discuss restructuring terms for the existing loan instruments. He wrote that he would be in contact. He did not come in person. She put the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while, and then she put it in the drawer, not with the unopened ones, but deliberately, face up, on top of them. Chayton came back once. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the storm. He came with his grandfather and 2 other men from the community, and he stood in the yard while the men talked with Maeve about a proposal, an arrangement by which the tribe would send riders to the ranch monthly, bringing horses that needed rehabilitation work, in exchange for access to the creek corridor and a formal collaborative relationship that the tribal administration was prepared to support with both resources and legal standing. Maeve listened to all of this. She asked a few questions. She agreed to think about it, which was her way of already having decided. Chayton stood near the stable door through the whole conversation. He had a different look now, back in his own context, in his own clothes, with the easy confidence of someone standing on known ground. He did not look like the boy she had pulled from the straw in the dark of the storm. He looked like what he actually was, someone's grandson, someone's future. Before they left, he went briefly into the stable. She gave him 5 minutes and then went in herself. He was standing in Creek's stall, one hand on the stallion's neck, speaking quietly, in his language, not hers, the words low and rhythmic and not intended for her. The stallion stood with his eyes half closed and his breathing slow. The eagle feather was still on the halter. She had not moved it. Chayton left without ceremony. He walked out to where his grandfather's truck was idling and got in without looking back, the way people leave when they know they're coming back. She stood in the stable door and watched the truck go. The sun was full on the yard now, the kind of March sun that is entirely sincere about being warm even when the air hasn't caught up with it yet. The new section of the stable roof caught the light at a slightly different angle than the old one, and for a moment the whole structure seemed to be 2 things at once, what it had been and what it was becoming. She had not cried since Gerald's funeral. She had made a decision, in the months after, that grief expressed that way was a form of motion she couldn't afford. That keeping the ranch meant keeping moving, and keeping moving meant keeping the expression of certain things in suspension. She stood in the stable door with the March sun on her face and the sound of horses breathing behind her, and she let herself cry without doing anything about it, without justifying it or stopping it, or stepping away from it into the next task. The land around her was quiet and enormous and full of light. She stayed there until the sun moved. There is a word in the science of attachment, a word researchers use when they talk about what happens between humans and the environments they build their deepest lives inside of. The word is place identity. The idea is that we don't just live in places. We become them, partially. We fold ourselves into them, and they fold themselves into us, and after enough time the boundary between the two becomes more theoretical than real. Maeve had built herself into this land over 31 years. The ranch had Gerald's hands in every repaired fence, every gate hinge, every post sunk into frozen ground. It had her hands in it too, in ways she had stopped seeing because the familiar stops being visible after a while. It had the horses in it. It had the creek. It had the slow and ancient topography of a place that predated every human name placed on it. What the storm brought was not rescue. Rescue implies a before and an after with nothing carried between them. What the storm brought was something harder to name and more permanent. A boy who came out of the cold without knowing whose threshold he was crossing. A horse that had been waiting for a language no one on this ranch had known. A woman who opened a door into the dark not because she was brave, but because she had already spent 11 months standing still and something in her couldn't do it anymore. If you watch this story from the outside, you might call it coincidence. The right moment, the right storm, the right set of circumstances aligning. But there is another way to read it. You can read it as the story of what happens when a person stops building walls against the world and starts, again, just barely, just tentatively, leaving the door unlocked. The feather is still on the halter. The roof is being weathered in. The creek is running. If this story found something in you, if it sat in some part of you that recognizes the feeling of a door you've been standing behind for too long, leave a comment. Tell me your city. Tell me what it found. And we'll meet here again next week.